I rolled my shoulders, trying to work out 3 weeks of accumulated tension from the training exercises. Camp Pendleton's underground mock-ups had been brutal, crawling through concrete tunnels, practicing breach techniques, and running data retrieval drills until we could do them blindfolded. My gear sat neatly arranged on my bunk, every piece cleaned and inspected according to Marine standards. The other guys in my unit were scattered around the barracks, most of them checking equipment one final time or catching up on sleep. Michael Thompson sat cross-legged on his bunk, field stripping his sidearm with the kind of mechanical precision that came from years of deployment experience. His broad shoulders and weathered face told the story of multiple tours overseas, and he moved with the calm efficiency of someone who'd seen real combat. David Rodriguez occupied the bunk across from mine, methodically organizing his pack according to some internal system only he understood. Tall and lean, he had this way of approaching every task like it was a puzzle that needed solving. The scar along his jawline caught the fluorescent light as he worked, a reminder of whatever firefight had earned him that mark during his last deployment. Robert Wilson sat near the window, running a cleaning cloth over his rifle barrel for probably the 4th time today. Stocky and powerful, he had the kind of build that suggested he could carry twice his body weight without breaking a sweat. The tribal tattoos on his forearms were visible with his sleeves rolled up, and I'd caught him checking the parking lot outside every few minutes like he was expecting company. We'd been through these underground operations together for 3 weeks straight, learning to navigate tight spaces, extract data from hostile environments, and work as a coordinated unit in situations where communication might be compromised. The training had been more intense than usual, with scenarios that felt less like exercises and more like preparation for something specific. The barracks door opened with its familiar squeak, and Lieutenant Colonel Charles Fisher stepped inside. The change in atmosphere was immediate. Conversations stopped mid-sentence, and everyone straightened up without being told. Fisher had that effect on people. His graying hair was perfectly groomed according to regulations, and his uniform looked like it had been pressed moments before walking in. "Gentlemen," Fisher said, his voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed without question. "I need Martinez, Thompson, Rodriguez, and Wilson in briefing room C in 10 minutes. Full dress uniform." Michael looked up from his weapon, raising an eyebrow. "Sir, is this about our next assignment?" Fisher's expression remained neutral, but something in his posture suggested he was operating under tight constraints. 10 minutes, Marines. Don't be late." He turned and left without another word, leaving the 4 of us to exchange glances. In 3 weeks of training, Fisher had never called a private briefing. Usually, mission assignments came through the regular chain of command with proper documentation and advance notice. I changed into my dress uniform, making sure every detail was regulation perfect. The fabric felt stiff compared to the tactical gear I'd been wearing for weeks, but Fisher's tone suggested this briefing was important enough to warrant formal presentation. Robert finished with his rifle and started getting dressed. "Anyone else think the Colonel's been acting strange lately?" "Define strange," David said, folding his field uniform with military precision. "I mean more wound up than usual. Haven't seen him crack a smile in days." Michael holstered his sidearm and grabbed his dress jacket. "Officers don't get paid to smile, Wilson. They get paid to make decisions we don't have to think about." We made our way across the base to the briefing room, a sterile concrete space with a single table, several chairs, and a projection screen that looked like it hadn't been updated since the 1990s. Fisher was already waiting when we arrived, standing behind the table with a manila folder and what appeared to be equipment requisition forms. "Close the door and take seats," Fisher said. I settled into one of the metal chairs, noting that Fisher hadn't brought any of his usual staff. No adjutants, no clerks, no other officers. Just the 5 of us in a room that suddenly felt smaller than it should have. Fisher opened the folder and pulled out several photographs. Aerial shots of desert terrain with what looked like concrete structures partially buried in sand. "Gentlemen, you've been selected for Operation True Sight. This is a classified data retrieval mission in the Nevada desert. He slid the photographs across the table where we could examine them. The images showed a decommissioned facility that looked like it had been abandoned for decades. Concrete bunkers, access roads that had been reclaimed by desert vegetation, and what appeared to be entrance shafts that were mostly covered by accumulated sand and debris. The target is a research facility that was constructed in the 1950s for weapons development, Fisher continued. The facility was abandoned in 1958, and according to official records, all materials were removed during the decommissioning process. Michael studied one of the aerial photos. Sir, if everything was removed, what exactly are we retrieving? Fisher's jaw tightened slightly. Intelligence suggests that valuable technology and documentation remain in the facility, materials that could benefit current military operations. I examined the photographs more closely. The facility looked substantial. Multiple building foundations visible from the air with what appeared to be underground connections between structures. How large is this place, sir? Approximately 40,000 square feet of underground space across multiple levels, Fisher said. Your mission is to conduct a complete sweep, document everything you find, and retrieve any materials of potential value. Robert leaned forward in his chair. Sir, why wasn't this facility properly cleared during decommissioning? Fisher looked at his watch, the third time he'd checked it since starting the briefing. The circumstances surrounding the facility's closure are unclear. Personnel were transferred to other assignments, but there's no record of a formal equipment removal process. Something about Fisher's explanation didn't sit right with me. Military facilities didn't get abandoned with valuable materials still inside. There were procedures, protocols, chains of custody. The idea that weapons research technology would just be left behind seemed impossible. What kind of weapons research was conducted there? David asked. That information is classified above your clearance level, Fisher replied quickly. Your focus should be on the current mission parameters, not historical details. Fisher pulled out equipment requisition forms and distributed them around the table. The list included heavy-duty cutting tools, advanced communication devices, extra ammunition, and specialized documentation equipment. It was enough gear for a week-long operation, not a simple data retrieval. You'll have access to anything on this list, Fisher said. The mission timeline is 48 hours from now. You'll fly to Nellis Air Force Base in Nevada and then travel by military vehicle to the target location. I scanned the equipment list, noting items that seemed excessive for a routine retrieval operation. Thermal cutting equipment, explosive charges, combat medical supplies. Sir, are we expecting resistance? Fisher's eyes met mine for the first time during the briefing, and I caught something that looked like uncertainty before his expression hardened again. The facility has been unoccupied for decades. However, given the classified nature of the original research, we're taking all necessary precautions. Michael set down his copy of the equipment list. What's our extraction timeline? Complete the mission and return to Nellis within 72 hours, Fisher said. Radio contact will be maintained through a command post I'll establish 20 miles from the target site. Robert shifted in his chair. Sir, will you be accompanying us into the facility? Negative. I'll coordinate from the command post and maintain communication with higher command. Fisher gathered the photographs and returned them to the folder. This mission is crucial for national security interests. Failure is not an option. The way he emphasized those last words suggested consequences beyond the usual military disciplinary measures. Fisher checked his watch again, and I noticed a thin layer of sweat on his forehead that had nothing to do with the temperature in the room. Any other questions? Fisher asked, but his tone indicated the briefing was essentially over. David raised his hand slightly. Sir, what's our cover story if anyone asks about our deployment? Training exercise, desert survival, and navigation. Nothing more specific than that. Fisher stood up, signaling the end of the meeting. Dismissed. Be ready for departure at 600 hours, day after tomorrow. We rose from our chairs and started toward the door, but Fisher's voice stopped us. And gentlemen, This operation never officially existed. Make sure you understand what that means. The implication was clear enough. Whatever we found in that Nevada bunker, it would stay between the five of us, and whoever Fisher answered to up the chain of command. I filed out with the others, but Fisher's tension stayed with me. In my experience, officers only got that nervous when they were dealing with situations that could end careers or lives. Fisher concluded by stating we would deploy within 48 hours and that our success would be crucial for national security interests. I checked my watch as the C-130 transport touched down at Nellis Air Force Base. The 48 hours since Fisher's briefing had passed in a blur of equipment preparation and final gear checks. We'd spent the flight reviewing mission parameters and studying the aerial photographs Fisher had shown us, but now the abstract planning was about to become concrete reality. The Nevada desert stretched endlessly beyond the base perimeter, a harsh landscape of rocky outcroppings and sparse vegetation that looked like it could hide secrets for decades without anyone noticing. Our military vehicle sat waiting on the tarmac, a heavy-duty truck equipped with GPS navigation, communication equipment, and enough supplies for a week-long operation. Michael loaded the thermal cutting equipment into the truck bed while David organized our packs according to his usual systematic approach. Robert handled the weapons and ammunition, checking each piece with the kind of methodical attention that had kept us alive through multiple deployments. I secured the documentation equipment and camera gear, making sure everything was protected against the desert environment. The drive took us deeper into the Nevada wasteland than I'd expected. For 6 hours, we followed GPS coordinates through terrain that became increasingly desolate, tracking along dirt roads that barely qualified as trails. The coordinates Fisher had provided led us through areas that showed no signs of human activity. No tire tracks, no discarded equipment. Nothing to suggest anyone had been here in years. When we finally stopped, the landscape around us looked identical to every other stretch of desert we'd crossed. Rocky ground dotted with scrub brush, low hills that could hide anything behind them, and the kind of silence that made you aware of your own breathing. I climbed out of the truck and immediately felt the dry heat pull moisture from my skin. "Coordinates match," David announced, checking his handheld GPS unit. "Target should be within 50 meters of this position." We spread out in a search pattern, looking for any indication of the concrete structures we'd seen in the aerial photographs. The decades of wind and sand had done their work. What we eventually found looked more like a natural rock formation than military construction. Robert spotted it first, calling our attention to an area where the ground looked different, where metal edges protruded slightly from accumulated debris. The bunker entrance was exactly as Fisher had described, 8 feet tall and 4 feet wide, constructed from steel that had been painted military green decades ago. Now the paint was mostly gone, replaced by rust and corrosion that told the story of years exposed to desert conditions. Multiple locks secured the door, each one seized completely shut by rust and sand infiltration. I established radio contact with Fisher's command post while the others began clearing sand and debris from around the entrance. "Base camp, this is Martinez. We've located the target site and are beginning entry procedures." Fisher's voice came through clearly, without the static interference we'd experienced during equipment testing. "Copy, Martinez. Document everything and maintain regular contact. What's your assessment of the entrance condition?" "Door is heavily corroded but structurally sound," I reported. "Multiple lock mechanisms will require cutting. Michael's preparing thermal equipment now." Michael had already unpacked the cutting torch and was checking gas levels in the fuel tanks. The equipment was military grade, designed to cut through hardened steel in battlefield conditions. He put on protective gear and fired up the torch, the blue flame casting strange shadows across the desert landscape. The cutting process took longer than expected. Each lock had been designed to resist forced entry, with hardened steel cores that required multiple passes to breach completely. David and Robert worked steadily to clear sand from the access tunnel beyond the door, revealing concrete steps that descended into darkness. I monitored our communications throughout the cutting operation, noting periodic bursts of static that hadn't occurred during our equipment tests back at Camp Pendleton. The interference lasted only seconds at a time, but it was consistent enough to suggest some kind of electronic system still operating in the area. Static interference on multiple frequencies, I reported to Fisher. Duration approximately 3 to 5 seconds, occurring every 10 to 15 minutes. Noted, Fisher replied. Could be atmospheric conditions or residual equipment in the facility. Continue with entry procedures. The final lock gave way with a metallic clang that echoed across the empty desert. Michael shut down the cutting torch and stepped back as David and Robert pulled the heavy steel door open. The hinges protested with a grinding sound that suggested they hadn't moved in decades. Cold air flowed out of the opening, carrying the stale smell of a space that had been sealed for years. It wasn't unbreathable. The air moved slightly, suggesting the ventilation system still functioned at least partially. But there was something else in the smell, something that reminded me of old concrete and metal that had been sitting in darkness for too long. Our flashlights revealed a concrete staircase descending into the facility. The construction was clearly military grade, with reinforced walls and ventilation shafts that ran along the ceiling. Emergency lighting fixtures were mounted at regular intervals, but none of them responded when we tested the main power switches near the entrance. I documented our entry time and established communication protocols with base camp. Fisher, this is Martinez. We have successful breach at 13:47 hours. Staircase leads down approximately 30 feet based on flashlight range. Emergency lighting non-functional despite presence of backup power systems. Copy. Maintain hourly contact and document everything you encounter. Radio check every 15 minutes during initial exploration. I shouldered my pack and checked my equipment one final time. The camera was ready, extra batteries were accessible, and my sidearm was secure, but available if needed. Michael, David, and Robert had their gear arranged efficiently, with weapons ready but not overly aggressive. We'd learned from experience that paranoia could be as dangerous as carelessness in unknown environments. We descended single file, with Robert taking point and me maintaining rear security. The concrete steps were solid, showing no signs of structural damage or deterioration. Our footsteps echoed in the confined space, the sound bouncing off walls that felt much thicker than standard construction. The temperature dropped noticeably as we moved deeper underground. What had been desert heat at ground level became cool, almost chilly air that suggested we were entering a significant underground complex. The walls remained concrete throughout our descent, reinforced with steel supports that spoke to serious engineering effort. At the bottom of the staircase, our flashlights revealed a corridor stretching into darkness in both directions. The floor was polished concrete, clean except for a thin layer of dust that suggested minimal air circulation. Ventilation grates in the ceiling were visible but silent, and the emergency lighting remained completely dark. I checked my radio and established contact with Fisher. Base camp, we've reached the main level. Corridor extends in both directions. Emergency lighting still non-functional. Beginning systematic exploration now. The facility felt larger than the aerial photographs had suggested, with the kind of solid construction that was built to last decades. But there was something unsettling about the complete absence of power, the way our voices carried in the empty corridors, and the periodic static bursts that continued to interfere with our radio communications. I started down the left branch of the corridor, my flashlight beam cutting through darkness that felt thick enough to touch. The concrete floor under my boots was solid, professionally finished, with expansion joints that showed this place had been built to last. Michael fell in behind me while David and Robert took the right side, our lights creating overlapping circles of visibility in what appeared to be a much larger space than the aerial photos had suggested. The corridor stretched ahead of us for what looked like at least 200 feet, with doorways spaced evenly along both walls every 20 or 30 feet. Each entrance was marked with simple metal placards: Laboratory A, Laboratory B, Storage 1, Storage 2. The numbering system continued as far as our lights could reach, suggesting a facility designed for serious, long-term research operations. "James, you getting pictures of these room markers?" Michael asked, adjusting his pack straps. I raised my camera and started documenting the layout, making sure to capture the systematic organization of the facility. The hallway felt like something from a government installation or university research building, not the weapons depot Fisher had described. Each doorway was fitted with heavy wooden doors that had small wire-reinforced glass windows, though most of the glass was too dusty to see through clearly. My radio crackled to life with Fisher's voice. "Martinez, radio check. What's your status?" "Base camp. We're conducting systematic exploration of the main level. Corridor extends approximately 200 feet with multiple laboratory spaces. Beginning room-by-room documentation now." "Copy. Maintain schedule and keep me informed of significant findings." I hooked the radio back onto my belt and approached the first door on our side. Laboratory A was unlocked, the handle turning easily when I tested it. The door opened with a slight squeak, revealing a room filled with equipment I recognized from old science textbooks and military technical manuals. The laboratory contained workbenches arranged in precise rows, each one equipped with devices that looked like they belonged in a 1950s university physics department. Oscilloscopes with round cathode ray screens sat next to microscopes with brass fittings and adjustment knobs. Document filing systems lined the walls, metal cabinets with small drawers and index cards still visible in some of the slots. I moved through the room methodically, photographing everything from multiple angles. The equipment appeared to have been abandoned mid-operation, with adjustment dials left in specific positions and notebooks still open on several workbenches. One microscope had a glass slide still mounted in the viewing stage, though I couldn't make out what specimen might have been left there for decades. Michael started collecting loose papers and research notes that were scattered across the workbenches. Most of the documents were typed on official letterhead, with stamps and signatures that looked authentic. He held up a particularly thick folder and skimmed through the contents. "These are interesting," he said. "Reports about optical enhancement technology and visual perception studies. Names I recognize from the personnel files Fisher showed us back at Pendleton." David's voice came from across the hall, where he and Robert were examining another laboratory. "Same type of equipment over here. Looks like they were running parallel experiments in multiple rooms." I finished documenting Laboratory A and moved to the next room, finding similar setups but with variations in the equipment arrangements. Laboratory B contained more sophisticated optical devices, what looked like prototype camera equipment and lens assemblies that were more advanced than anything I'd seen in standard military gear. The precision of the workmanship suggested these weren't off-the-shelf components but custom-built devices designed for specific research applications. We worked our way down the corridor systematically, photographing and cataloging everything we found. Each laboratory told the same story. Serious scientific research that had been interrupted suddenly, with expensive equipment left behind and experiments apparently abandoned in progress. The level of organization and the quality of the facilities made Fisher's explanation about valuable technology being left behind seem more plausible. After 40 minutes of documentation, Robert's voice carried down the hallway from a laboratory near the center of the facility. "James, Michael, you need to see this." The tone of his voice made me abandon the camera equipment I'd been examining and head toward the location where he and David were working. I found them standing in the doorway of what appeared to be a larger laboratory space, their flashlights pointed at the far wall. The graffiti covered almost the entire concrete surface in frantic, uneven letters that had been carved deep into the wall with something sharp. "They're here," was scratched in 6-inch tall letters near eye level. Below that, "Don't trust your eyes," was gouged even deeper, and at the bottom, "Wilson was right," appeared in handwriting that looked increasingly desperate. The messages weren't painted or written with a marker. Someone had used a knife or chisel to carve each letter into solid concrete, leaving rough grooves that spoke to either incredible determination or complete desperation. The depth of the carving suggested whoever made these marks had spent significant time and effort to ensure they would be permanent. I approached the wall and examined the graffiti more closely. The handwriting showed signs of stress. Letters that started neat became progressively more erratic, with some words trailing off, as if the person making them had been interrupted or exhausted. The concrete around each carved letter showed chips and scratches that indicated multiple attempts to get the letters deep enough. "Bloodstains," David said, pointing his flashlight toward the floor directly beneath the graffiti. I looked down and saw dark brown stains covering several square feet of concrete. The stains had the distinctive pattern of dried blood that had pooled and then been left undisturbed for years. The discoloration was heaviest directly under the wall, as if someone had been standing there while bleeding heavily. My radio crackled again. "Martinez, 15-minute check. Report status. Base camp. We're documenting unusual findings in the central laboratory area. Graffiti indicating distress from facility personnel. Continuing systematic exploration. Copy. Any indication of the missing technology?" I looked around the room, noting that most of the equipment here appeared to be the same 1950s research devices we'd been finding throughout the facility. Negative on advanced technology. Standard research equipment consistent with period of operation. Michael had moved to an adjacent room while I was talking to Fisher. His voice came through the connecting doorway with a tension I hadn't heard from him before. "James, you really need to get over here." I stepped through the doorway and immediately understood his reaction. Two complete human skeletons sat at laboratory benches, positioned as if they'd been working when death occurred. The bones were arranged naturally, not scattered or disturbed, suggesting the bodies had decomposed in place over the decades since the facility's abandonment. Each skull showed a single, perfectly round hole behind the right ear. The holes were clean and precise, exactly the size and placement that would result from close-range pistol fire. The positioning was identical on both skeletons. Someone had either executed both individuals with military precision, or they had coordinated their own deaths with careful planning. Personal effects lay scattered around each skeleton. I photographed everything before examining the identification documents more closely. The first skeleton wore a laboratory coat with a name tag still pinned to the fabric. Dr. Harold Peterson. His wallet contained military identification and research credentials that matched the personnel files Fisher had shown us. The second skeleton was identified through similar documentation as Dr. Margaret Foster. Like Peterson, her credentials indicated she was a senior project scientist assigned to the Nevada facility during the 1950s research program. I documented the scene from multiple angles, making sure to capture both the positioning of the remains and the evident cause of death. The bullet holes were unmistakable, and the identical placement suggested either execution by a single shooter or a coordinated suicide pact between the two scientists. "Why would they choose this?" I said, more to myself than to the others. Michael looked up from the documents he'd been examining. "What do you mean?" "If the facility was being evacuated, why would two senior scientists choose death over leaving? They had credentials, clearances, value to other research programs. None of this makes sense if it was just a routine facility closure." David had been examining the laboratory equipment around the skeletons. Maybe they weren't given a choice about leaving. I considered that possibility while finishing my photographic documentation. The evidence suggested something had gone drastically wrong during the facility's final days, something serious enough that evacuation wasn't an option for the senior research staff. But what could have been threatening enough to make death seem preferable to departure? I finished documenting the skeletons of Peterson and Foster, but the questions David had raised wouldn't leave me alone. The desperate graffiti carved into concrete, the bloodstains that told a story of violence, none of it matched Fisher's description of a routine facility closure. "There's got to be more," I said, hooking my camera strap around my neck. "Senior scientists don't just execute themselves during an evacuation. Something forced them to make that choice." Michael was collecting Wilson's scattered research notes from around the laboratory benches. The papers were yellowed with age but still legible, covered with precise handwriting and technical diagrams that looked like serious scientific work. These notes keep mentioning Wilson's warnings to Pentagon officials. Sounds like he was trying to tell someone about a major threat. David's voice carried from the corridor where he and Robert had been mapping the facility layout. "James, Michael, we found something. There's another level down here." I stepped out of the laboratory and found them standing near what appeared to be the end of the main corridor. A heavy steel door was set into the concrete wall, painted military green and marked with multiple warning signs. "Authorized personnel only" was stenciled in bold red letters across the center, with smaller text below warning about restricted access and criminal penalties for unauthorized entry. The door was built like a bank vault, with reinforced steel construction and multiple locking mechanisms that went far beyond standard security measures. Whoever had designed this section of the facility hadn't wanted casual access to whatever lay beyond. The locks were different from those we'd encountered at the main entrance, newer, more sophisticated, and designed to resist both mechanical and explosive breaching attempts. "This doesn't match the facility schematics Fisher showed us," Robert observed, running his hands along the doorframe. The aerial photos suggested single-level construction with basic storage areas. I established radio contact with base camp while David and Robert examined the locking mechanisms. "Fisher, this is Martinez. We've located a secured area not shown in mission briefings. Reinforced access door with multiple restricted access warnings, requesting guidance on breach procedures." Static interference lasted longer than usual before Fisher's voice came through. "Martinez, you're authorized to proceed with entry using whatever methods necessary. Document everything and maintain contact." The response surprised me. Fisher's earlier briefings had emphasized caution and systematic exploration, but now he was authorizing explosive entry without knowing what lay beyond the door. His voice carried the same tension I'd noticed during our mission briefing back at Pendleton. David had already unpacked breaching charges from his equipment kit. The explosive devices were small but powerful, designed to punch through hardened steel without causing structural damage to surrounding areas. He positioned them carefully around the locking mechanisms, while Robert cleared the corridor of loose debris that might become projectiles. "Fire in the hole," David announced, and we took cover around the corner of the corridor. The explosion echoed through the underground facility with a sharp crack that reverberated off the concrete walls. Dust and smoke filled the air, and I could smell the distinctive chemical odor of military explosives. When the debris settled, the steel door hung open on twisted hinges, revealing darkness beyond. I switched on my flashlight and approached the opening while Michael moved to cover the opposite angle. The space beyond was another corridor, but this one was different from the upper level. The walls were painted white instead of bare concrete, and the floor was covered with industrial carpet that had somehow survived decades of abandonment. We descended a short flight of stairs and found ourselves in what appeared to be a high-security research area. The construction here was more sophisticated: soundproofed walls, specialized ventilation systems, and laboratory spaces equipped with devices I didn't recognize from standard military equipment. The corridor led to a central laboratory that was larger and more advanced than anything we'd discovered on the upper level. Scientific equipment covered multiple workstations with prototype devices that looked decades ahead of the 1950s technology we'd been finding throughout the facility. 2 more skeletons occupied this laboratory, but the scene they presented was far more disturbing than what we'd found upstairs. The first skeleton sat at a central workbench, slumped forward with a .45 caliber pistol still clutched in its skeletal fingers. Personal identification scattered around the workstation confirmed this was Dr. John Wilson, the man whose name had been carved into the concrete wall above. His laboratory coat hung from the skeletal frame, and research notes covered the work surface around him. But it was the second corpse that made me stop photographing and stare. The body lay on the floor near Wilson's workstation. An identification document scattered nearby indicated this was also John G. Wilson, the same name but clearly a different person. What remained of this corpse defied every expectation of human anatomy I'd ever encountered. The face was completely distorted, with bone structure that looked like it had been stretched and reformed by some unknown process. The skull cavity was enlarged far beyond normal human proportions, creating a head that appeared almost grotesquely oversized. The limbs were elongated to lengths that would have made normal movement impossible, and the torso showed deformities that suggested this person had never been fully human. I forced myself to document the scene systematically, photographing both skeletons from multiple angles while trying to process what I was seeing. The deformed corpse wore clothing that appeared to be the same period and style as Wilson's, but the proportions were all wrong, as if someone had tried to dress a 7-foot-tall person in garments designed for normal human dimensions. Michael had moved to examine Wilson's research notes, which were scattered across the workbench and floor around his skeleton. The papers were covered with urgent handwriting and technical diagrams that showed increasingly frantic efforts to document some kind of scientific discovery. "James, you need to read these," Michael said, holding up a thick folder marked with classified stamps. I approached Wilson's workstation and began reading through the research documentation. The notes described something called visual infiltration protocols and referenced enemy camouflage capabilities far beyond current understanding. Wilson had been working on prototype detection equipment, specialized goggles designed to reveal what he called non-human entities attempting human impersonation. The research notes contained detailed warnings about beings that could appear human to the naked eye but reveal their true nature under proper optical enhancement. Wilson had submitted multiple urgent reports to Pentagon officials, demanding immediate funding to mass-produce the detection goggles for military deployment. His documentation included test results showing that certain entities could maintain perfect human appearance under normal observation, but displayed obvious non-human characteristics when viewed through his specialized optical filters. The technical specifications described wavelength adjustments and enhancement protocols that would allow soldiers to identify these infiltrators in real-world conditions. I photographed page after page of Wilson's research, while the implications of what I was reading became increasingly clear. The deformed corpse on the laboratory floor wasn't human. It was one of these entities Wilson had been trying to expose, somehow revealed in its true form after death. The final research entry was dated December 15, 1958, written in handwriting that showed obvious signs of stress and fear. The words were carved deep into the paper, as if Wilson had pressed his pen hard enough to leave permanent impressions in the pages beneath. "They found us," the entry read. "God help anyone who comes after." I held my camera steady while documenting the final pages of Wilson's research notes, trying to capture every detail of his increasingly frantic handwriting. The technical specifications for his detection goggles were meticulously recorded despite the obvious stress he'd been under during those final days. Each diagram showed modifications to standard optical equipment that would allow soldiers to see through what Wilson called visual deception protocols. The implications were staggering. Wilson had identified a threat that could appear completely human under normal observation, but revealed its true nature when viewed through his specialized filters. His desperate warnings to Pentagon officials suddenly made sense. He'd been trying to expose infiltrators that conventional security measures couldn't detect. Movement caught my peripheral vision while I was adjusting the camera angle to capture a particularly detailed schematic. Someone stood in the corridor about 50 feet behind us, perfectly motionless, in a way that immediately commanded attention. I kept my camera raised, but shifted my focus to examine the figure more carefully. The soldier wore military fatigues that were wrong for our time period. The cut and color belonged to 1950s Army standard issue rather than modern uniforms, with the distinctive olive drab shade that had been phased out decades ago. His posture was ramrod straight but completely static, like someone standing at attention who had forgotten to move for hours. What struck me most was the absence of any identifying information. No name tapes, unit patches, rank insignia, or division markers were visible anywhere on his uniform. Military personnel always wore identification, especially in secure facilities. but this figure displayed nothing that would indicate his position or authority. "Michael, we've got company," I said quietly, keeping my voice steady while maintaining visual contact with the figure. Michael looked up from the research papers he'd been organizing and turned toward the corridor. His expression showed nothing but confusion as he scanned the area where I was pointing. "I don't see anyone, James." David and Robert had heard my warning and pivoted to check the corridor entrance. Both men swept their flashlights across the concrete walls and carpet, creating overlapping circles of illumination that should have revealed anyone standing in that space. "There's nobody there," David said, lowering his weapon but keeping his finger near the trigger guard. I kept my eyes fixed on the location where the soldier stood, watching him remain absolutely motionless while my teammates claimed they saw nothing. The figure wasn't transparent or flickering like some kind of hallucination. He appeared solid and real, casting shadows in the ambient light from our flashlights. 50 feet down the corridor, standing against the left wall, I insisted, pointing directly at the figure. "Military fatigues, 1950s issue, no identification visible." Robert moved his flashlight beam precisely where I was indicating, and the light passed right through the space the soldier occupied without revealing anything. Meanwhile, the figure continued standing at attention, showing no reaction to being illuminated or discussed. Something was seriously wrong with what I was experiencing compared to what the others could observe. Wilson's research had specifically documented entities that appeared human under normal visual conditions, but revealed their true nature under enhanced observation. Maybe whatever had happened to my vision during our time in the bunker was allowing me to see something the others couldn't detect. "I'm going to check it out," I announced, shouldering my camera while keeping my sidearm readily accessible. Michael moved to accompany me, but I gestured for him to stay with the research materials. If something was wrong with my perception, I didn't want to put the whole team at risk based on what might be a stress-induced hallucination. I approached the location where the soldier stood, watching him remain completely motionless as I closed the distance. His uniform details became clearer with proximity. Standard Army field gear from an era when equipment was built for durability rather than modern functionality. His boots were combat models that had been discontinued before any of us were born. At 20 feet away, the figure vanished, not gradually or with any dramatic effect. One moment he was there, the next moment he wasn't. The space where he'd been standing was completely empty, showing nothing but painted concrete wall and industrial carpet. I reached the exact location where he'd been positioned, and immediately noticed what hadn't been there during our initial sweep of the corridor. Fresh blood covered the floor in a pool roughly 3 feet in diameter, dark red and glistening wet under my flashlight beam. I knelt down and touched the edge of the blood pool with my finger. Warm. Not just recently spilled, but body temperature warm, as if it had come from someone who was bleeding right now. "Michael, get over here," I called, standing up while carefully avoiding stepping in the blood. Michael jogged down the corridor and stopped short when he saw what I'd discovered. His face went pale as he examined the scene, understanding immediately that we had a serious problem. "This wasn't here 20 minutes ago," he said, crouching to get a better look at the blood. "We walked through this exact area when we first came down here." David and Robert joined us within seconds, their expressions shifting to high alert as they processed what we'd found. None of us were injured, and the blood was too fresh to have been here when we arrived. "Radio check," Michael said, unclipping his communication device. "Base camp, this is team leader. We have an urgent situation requiring immediate extraction." Static filled the air instead of Fisher's voice. Michael tried multiple frequencies, adjusting settings and checking equipment connections, but every channel returned the same white noise interference. "Base camp, this is Martinez requesting immediate response," I transmitted on my own radio. "We have discovered fresh evidence of hostile presence and require extraction protocols." Nothing but static came through the speakers. The complete loss of communication meant either something was jamming our equipment or Fisher's command post had gone dark completely. Robert had moved to provide security coverage while David examined the blood more closely with his flashlight. The pooling pattern suggested someone had been standing or lying in this location while bleeding heavily from an unknown source. "We need to get out of here now," David said, straightening up from his examination. "Whoever left this blood could still be in the facility." I looked back down the corridor toward the laboratory where Wilson's research materials waited to be collected. Everything we'd discovered pointed toward threats that could move undetected through normal security measures. The mysterious soldier I'd seen might have been one of these entities Wilson had tried to warn officials about. "Grab Wilson's research," I ordered, checking my watch and noting we'd been underground for almost 3 hours. "Documents, photographs, anything that explains what he was working on. We take everything we can carry." Michael and David returned to the laboratory while Robert and I maintained watch on the corridor. The fresh blood served as evidence that we weren't alone in this facility, and whatever had caused it possessed capabilities that our training hadn't prepared us for. The team worked quickly to gather documentation and secure our equipment for rapid evacuation. Wilson's research notes went into protective cases while Michael organized the photographs we'd taken throughout the facility. Everything we'd discovered needed to reach officials who could understand the implications of what Wilson had been trying to expose. I shouldered my pack and conducted a final check of our immediate area, making sure we'd collected everything of potential value. The blood pool remained exactly as we'd found it, warm and fresh, with no indication of where it had come from or who had lost it. "Ready to move," David announced, securing his equipment while Robert checked the corridor approach to the staircase. We moved in formation toward the facility exit, maintaining tactical spacing and communication discipline despite our malfunctioning radios. I found myself checking over my shoulder every few steps, watching for any sign of the figure I'd encountered or other evidence of hostile presence. The concrete staircase leading to the upper level appeared exactly as we'd left it, but something felt different about the facility's atmosphere. The air seemed thicker, and our footsteps echoed differently off the walls as we climbed toward the main corridor. Halfway up the stairs, emergency lighting flickered on throughout the bunker. Red illumination flooded the corridors for the first time since our arrival, creating visibility that revealed the full scope of the underground complex. The lighting system activated section by section, moving from the secured area toward the main entrance, as if something was systematically powering up the facility's electrical systems. I turned to look back at the corridors we were leaving behind, now visible under the emergency lighting. Empty hallways stretched into the distance, showing no sign of movement or occupancy, but the timing of the power activation suggested our presence had triggered some kind of automated response. "Keep moving," Michael urged, taking point on the final section of stairs leading to the surface level. The emergency lighting continued flickering on as we climbed, illuminating our path while revealing the facility's true size and complexity. What we'd explored with flashlights represented only a fraction of the underground space, and now we could see additional corridors and laboratory areas, extending far beyond what our limited visibility had revealed. Behind us, the facility hummed with electrical activity that hadn't existed during our entire time underground. Whatever had activated the emergency systems was aware of our presence and wanted us to see exactly what we were leaving behind. I pushed through the bunker entrance expecting to find empty desert, but Fisher stood 20 feet away next to a convoy of military vehicles that definitely hadn't been there when we'd gone underground. A full cleanup crew was already unloading equipment from the trucks. Concrete mixers, steel reinforcement materials, and heavy machinery designed for permanent construction work. The timing made no sense. Our communications had been down for over an hour, which meant Fisher couldn't have known when we'd surface or what we'd discovered. Yet here he was with enough personnel and equipment to seal an entire military facility, positioned as if he'd been waiting for us to emerge with specific findings. "Report!" Fisher called out as our team approached his position. His voice carried the same controlled tension I'd noticed during our original briefing, but now it seemed mixed with something that looked like relief. "Sir, we encountered evidence of hostile presence in the facility," I began, unslinging my pack while trying to process the scene around us. Fresh blood, possible infiltration, and visual contact with an unknown individual in military fatigues. Fisher nodded without any change in expression, as if I'd just confirmed something he already knew. No questions about the blood, no surprise about the mysterious figure, no concern about potential threats to his personnel. "Any casualties to your team?" he asked, checking his watch in the same nervous habit I'd observed back at Pendleton. "Negative, sir, but we lost radio contact completely and discovered research materials that suggest—" "Understood," Fisher interrupted, gesturing toward the cleanup crew. "Technical teams will handle documentation and material recovery. I need individual debriefings from each of you immediately." Michael stepped forward with the research materials we'd collected from Wilson's laboratory. "Sir, we recovered significant documentation about the original research program. Wilson's notes indicate threats that—" "Not here," Fisher cut him off, glancing at the civilian contractors who were already setting up concrete forms around the bunker entrance. "Individual interviews only." The cleanup operation proceeded with military efficiency that suggested months of planning rather than an emergency response. Workers knew exactly where to position their equipment and moved with the coordination of a team that had practiced this specific procedure multiple times. Fisher conducted my debriefing 30 minutes later inside his command trailer, a mobile unit equipped with secure communication systems and recording equipment. He asked detailed questions about our route through the facility, the laboratory spaces we'd explored, and the condition of equipment we'd encountered. When I described the mysterious soldier in 1950s fatigues, Fisher leaned forward with obvious interest. This was the first time during the entire debriefing that he'd shown any emotional response to my report. "Describe his appearance in detail," Fisher ordered, activating a digital recorder. "Uniform specifications, visible equipment positioning, duration of contact." I provided everything I could remember: the olive drab coloring, the absence of identifying patches, the absolute stillness of his posture. Fisher took notes throughout my description, occasionally asking for clarification about specific details. "You mentioned your teammates couldn't see this individual," Fisher observed, studying his notes. "Are you certain about their inability to observe the same figure?" "Completely certain, sir. I pointed directly at his location while they searched the same area with flashlights. They saw nothing." Fisher made additional notes before ending the recording session. His questions focused entirely on the mysterious soldier rather than the research materials, skeleton discoveries, or facility layout that seemed more relevant to mission objectives. The concrete trucks began pouring foundation material into the bunker entrance while Fisher interviewed the rest of my team. By evening, the entire access point was sealed with steel-reinforced concrete designed to prevent future entry. Whatever had been in that facility was now permanently buried. 2 days later at Nellis Air Force Base, Michael shook me awake at 0500 hours with orders to report for additional interviews. We'd been confined to base housing since returning from the mission, with no explanation about departure dates or future assignments. The interview facility was a sterile office building that looked more like a corporate headquarters than a military installation. Patricia Stevens from the Department of Defense and William Carter from the CIA occupied a conference room equipped with recording devices, legal documents, and files marked with classification levels I'd never seen before. Stevens appeared to be in her mid-40s with steel gray hair and expensive clothing that projected authority without warmth. She introduced herself with military efficiency while reviewing paperwork that contained details about our backgrounds, service records, and family members. Carter looked like someone who'd spent decades in intelligence work, with the kind of nondescript features that would make him invisible in a crowd. He positioned himself near the recording equipment and observed our reactions rather than asking direct questions. "Operation True Sight has been classified at the highest levels of national security," Stevens began, distributing thick folders marked with official seals. "Your participation in this mission requires formal acknowledgement of legal restrictions and behavioral expectations." The documents contained detailed descriptions of federal penalties for disclosing classified information, including provisions for treason charges and capital punishment in cases involving threats to national security. Each page required our signatures and initials, creating a legal framework that would allow prosecution for any public discussion of our mission. Specific elements of your report require additional classification protocols, Stevens continued, consulting her notes. Research materials recovered from the facility are not to be discussed under any circumstances. Personnel encounters during exploration phases are strictly prohibited topics for any future communication. Carter leaned forward when she mentioned personnel encounters, watching my reaction with obvious interest. Mr. Martinez, your debriefing included references to visual contact with an unidentified individual. This information falls under the highest classification levels, and discussing it would constitute treason punishable by death. The legal documents included non-disclosure agreements that prohibited researching any aspect of the mission, contacting family members of the original research team, or pursuing information about 1950s government programs in Nevada. Violation of these agreements would result in immediate court-martial and permanent imprisonment. Furthermore, Stevens added, reviewing additional paperwork, Operation True Sight never officially existed. Mission records will be sealed, and any attempt to verify or investigate this assignment through official channels will trigger federal prosecution. I signed each document while reading the restrictions carefully. The officials were particularly concerned about Wilson's research and my encounter with the mysterious soldier, dedicating multiple pages of legal warnings to those specific topics. Michael, David, and Robert completed identical paperwork during separate interview sessions throughout the day. We weren't allowed to discuss our individual debriefings or compare the questions we'd been asked. When I mentioned the soldier in outdated fatigues during my final signature session, Stevens and Carter exchanged a quick look that lasted maybe 2 seconds. Carter's expression showed what might have been recognition, while Stevens seemed to confirm something she'd already suspected. That particular observation requires the most restrictive classification protocols, Carter explained, adding additional signature requirements to my documentation. Any reference to historical military personnel would constitute a breach of national security. The officials provided departure orders that would separate our team permanently. Michael was transferring to Camp Lejeune, David to 29 Palms, Robert to Quantico, and I was being reassigned to administrative duties at Pendleton until my enlistment ended. Stevens emphasized our legal obligations one final time before dismissing us. These restrictions remain in effect permanently. Time does not diminish your legal exposure, and retirement from military service does not affect federal prosecution capabilities. Carter collected our signed documents while maintaining that same observational intensity he'd shown throughout the interviews. When he mentioned the phrase historical military personnel, I noticed he was specifically watching for my reaction to those words. We left Nellis Air Force Base the next morning on separate flights, with no opportunity to discuss what we'd experienced or compare our interview sessions. The officials had been thorough in their separation procedures, ensuring we couldn't coordinate our understanding of what had happened in that Nevada bunker. The restrictions felt comprehensive enough to prevent any future investigation. But I couldn't forget the way Stevens and Carter had looked at each other when I mentioned the soldier. Their reaction suggested they'd been expecting that specific detail, as if my encounter with the mysterious figure had confirmed something they already knew about the facility and its history. I pushed back from my desk and rubbed my eyes, squinting at the computer screen that had held my attention for the past 4 hours. The security consulting business kept me busy enough during the day, but evenings belonged to a different kind of work entirely. 5 years had passed since Operation True Sight, and I'd tried countless times to forget what happened in that Nevada bunker. The legal documents Stevens and Carter had forced me to sign were never far from my thoughts, reminding me that even researching the mission could land me in federal prison. But Wilson's face wouldn't leave me alone. Not the grotesquely deformed corpse we'd found in the lower laboratory, but the human Wilson. The scientist who'd tried to warn officials about threats they couldn't understand. Every night when I closed my eyes, I saw him hunched over his workbench, frantically documenting discoveries that would cost him his life. My Phoenix apartment wasn't much to look at, but it served my purposes well enough. The second bedroom had been converted into an office where I handled client paperwork and managed billing for the small businesses that hired me to evaluate their security systems. Corporate executives worried about employee theft and break-ins, never suspecting the kinds of threats Wilson had tried to expose existed beyond their comprehension. The coffee had gone cold hours ago, but I took another sip anyway while clicking through the National Archives database. Public records research had become an obsession I couldn't shake, even knowing the risks involved. I'd started with basic searches about 1950s government research programs, gradually working my way toward more specific information about optical physics projects and personnel assignments in Nevada. Tonight's breakthrough came from an unlikely source. The University of Colorado's physics department had digitized their alumni newsletters from the 1940s and 1950s, uploading decades of faculty updates and research announcements to their website. Most of the content was harmless academic news, but one entry from the spring 1955 newsletter caught my attention immediately. Dr. John G. Wilson, Ph.D. Physics, 1943, has accepted a senior research position with the Department of Defense, focusing on advanced optical physics applications for military reconnaissance. Dr. Wilson's groundbreaking work in visual perception technology has earned recognition from the highest levels of government officials. His current research involves prototype development for enhanced visual detection systems designed to identify enemy infiltration using advanced camouflage techniques. I printed the newsletter page and added it to the growing collection of documents spread across my desk. Each piece of information was legal to access and harmless on its own, but together they painted a picture that would probably violate every classification agreement I'd signed. The next search yielded even more specific results. The Physics Review archive contained abstracts from Wilson's published papers between 1951 and 1957, including detailed descriptions of his optical enhancement research. His work focused on developing filters and lenses that could reveal visual information invisible to normal human perception. One abstract from 1956 included technical specifications that made my hands shake as I read, "Prototype optical enhancement devices demonstrate capability to detect biological entities utilizing advanced visual deception protocols. Test subjects consistently identified non-human characteristics in entities that appeared completely human under standard visual observation. Applications for military security and infiltration detection require immediate development and deployment." I saved the document to my encrypted hard drive and continued searching through military personnel databases that had been declassified during the past decade. The Freedom of Information Act had forced the government to release thousands of documents from Cold War research programs, and Wilson's name appeared in multiple files related to Nevada facilities. A 1957 budget request specifically mentioned Wilson's team and their urgent need for increased funding. The document described critical national security applications for optical detection technology and referenced enemy infiltration capabilities far exceeding current intelligence estimates. Wilson had requested immediate approval to mass-produce detection goggles for deployment to military units worldwide. Instead of approval, the next document in Wilson's file was a termination notice dated December 20th, 1958. The Nevada research facility was being permanently closed, and all personnel were receiving immediate transfers to other assignments. Wilson and his core research team, Dr. Harold Peterson and Dr. Margaret Foster, were assigned to classified projects at different military installations across the country. But they never arrived at their new positions. I clicked through personnel records, cross-referencing military assignment databases with missing persons reports from early 1959. Wilson, Peterson, and Foster had simply vanished between their Nevada assignment and their scheduled arrivals at new facilities. No travel records, no personnel transfers, no forwarding addresses or contact information. The official explanation was administrative error. According to military records, the three scientists had been mistakenly removed from active duty rosters during the facility closure, creating paperwork confusion that took months to resolve. By the time officials realized the mistake, Wilson's team had apparently decided to pursue civilian careers and declined to respond to military contact attempts. I leaned back in my chair and studied the documents covering my desk. The timeline was clear. Wilson's team had made dangerous discoveries about infiltrating entities that could appear human under normal observation but revealed their true nature through specialized optical filters. They'd warned Pentagon officials about this threat repeatedly, requesting immediate action to protect military installations from infiltration. Instead of heeding Wilson's warnings, officials had terminated the research program and transferred the scientists to separate assignments where they could be silenced permanently. But something had gone wrong with the disposal plan. Wilson's team had been sealed inside the Nevada bunker with their research, left to die slowly while their dangerous knowledge was buried with them. The fresh blood we'd found 5 years ago suddenly made perfect sense. Wilson's entities were still active, still protecting the secret of their existence by eliminating anyone who discovered the truth about their infiltration capabilities. They'd killed Wilson's team in 1958, and they were prepared to kill anyone else who learned what Wilson had tried to expose. My phone rang at 11:30 p.m., interrupting my research. The caller ID showed a local number I didn't recognize, but I answered anyway. James Martinez. Silence on the other end, lasting long enough that I almost hung up. Then a voice spoke, flat, emotionless, and somehow familiar despite the poor connection quality. "You should stop reading about optical physics, Mr. Martinez." The line went dead before I could respond. I set the phone down carefully and looked at the documents scattered across my desk, understanding that someone was monitoring my research activities closely enough to know exactly what I'd been reading tonight. I gathered Wilson's files and locked them in the fireproof safe I kept hidden behind my bedroom closet. The research would continue, but I needed to be more careful about how I conducted it. Wilson had tried to warn officials through proper channels and ended up dead in a bunker with his colleagues. I wouldn't make the same mistake. The entities Wilson had discovered were still out there, still maintaining their infiltration of government and military positions. Stevens, Carter, Fisher, any of them could be non-human beings protecting their species' secret presence in American society. They'd buried Wilson's research and eliminated his team, but they couldn't erase every trace of what he'd discovered. I turned off the computer and checked the locks on my apartment door. Tomorrow I'd continue researching, but through different methods that would be harder to monitor. Wilson's detection technology might be buried, but his warnings about visual deception and infiltrating entities were still valid. Someone needed to understand what he'd tried to expose, even if it meant risking everything to learn the truth. I woke up the next morning with Wilson's research notes burning in my mind like a fever that wouldn't break. The phone call from the night before had left me unsettled, but now everything clicked together with horrifying clarity. I made coffee and spread Wilson's documents across my kitchen table, reading his warnings about visual deception protocols with fresh understanding. Wilson had written extensively about entities that could maintain perfect human appearance under normal observation, but revealed obvious non-human characteristics when viewed through his specialized optical filters. His test results showed these beings infiltrating military installations, government facilities, and research programs throughout the 1950s. They appeared completely human to everyone around them, speaking correctly, behaving appropriately, carrying proper identification and credentials. But Wilson's prototype goggles revealed the truth. Under enhanced optical observation, these entities displayed grotesquely deformed features, elongated limbs, and bone structures that defied human anatomy. The same characteristics I'd seen in the corpse lying next to Wilson's workstation. The thing that had somehow maintained human appearance until death exposed its true nature. My hands started shaking as I reread Wilson's technical specifications. His detection equipment worked by filtering specific light wavelengths that revealed biological inconsistencies invisible to normal human vision. The process was completely passive, requiring no special training or complex operation. Anyone wearing Wilson's goggles could identify infiltrating entities immediately, which meant the soldier I'd seen in the bunker had been one of these things. The pieces fell into place with sickening precision. I'd been able to see the mysterious figure while my teammates saw nothing because something about our time in the facility had altered my vision. Maybe exposure to Wilson's remaining equipment. Maybe residual effects from his optical experiments. Maybe just luck. But I'd been seeing what Wilson's goggles would have revealed. The true appearance of an infiltrating entity maintaining surveillance over its buried secrets. The soldier's 1950s uniform made perfect sense now. These beings had been present during Wilson's research program, probably monitoring his progress and reporting to their kind about his dangerous discoveries. When Wilson got too close to exposing them, they'd eliminated his entire team and sealed the facility. But they'd left behind one of their own to guard the location permanently, ensuring no future visitors could learn what Wilson had tried to warn officials about. The fresh blood we'd found hadn't come from any human source. It was evidence that the entity was still active, still protecting the buried research by eliminating anyone who discovered too much. Maybe it had killed other intruders over the decades, or maybe our presence had triggered some kind of defensive response that left physical traces. But the most terrifying realization was what this meant about Operation True Sight itself. Fisher had known exactly what we'd encounter in that bunker. His nervous behavior during the briefing, his immediate availability of cleanup crews, his lack of surprise about our discoveries. Everything pointed to deliberate planning rather than unexpected developments. We hadn't been sent to retrieve abandoned technology. We'd been sent as test subjects to determine whether Wilson's warnings were still relevant 60 years later. Fisher had wanted to know if these entities were still active and still protecting their secrets. Our team provided the perfect opportunity to gather intelligence without risking exposure of government officials who might already be compromised. If we died in the bunker, it would be explained as a training accident. If we survived and reported encounters with mysterious figures, it would confirm the ongoing threat and justify whatever measures Fisher had planned next. The cleanup operation had been staged and ready to deploy the moment we surfaced. Fisher's command post had never been 20 miles away. He'd been positioned close enough to monitor our progress and coordinate the immediate burial of anything we might have disturbed. The concrete trucks, steel reinforcement materials, and specialized crews had been waiting for days, possibly weeks, for our mission to provide the justification they needed to permanently seal the facility. Stevens and Carter's intense focus on my encounter with the soldier confirmed they'd been expecting exactly that kind of report. Their classification requirements weren't designed to protect national security. They were protecting the secret of non-human infiltration at the highest levels of government and military command. Which raised the question that made my blood run cold. How many of the officials involved in Operation True Sight were actually human? Fisher's behavior throughout the mission had seemed unusual but explainable through normal stress and secrecy requirements. But viewed through Wilson's research, his actions fit a different pattern entirely. An infiltrating entity would have perfect access to military personnel files, enabling it to select expendable test subjects for dangerous missions. It could coordinate complex operations without involving human officials who might ask uncomfortable questions about objectives and procedures. Stevens and Carter had displayed the same cold efficiency Wilson described in his notes about entity behavior. They'd shown no emotional response to our reports about death and violence, focusing instead on legal restrictions that would prevent any future investigation. Their knowledge of classification procedures and federal prosecution methods had been extensive and immediate, suggesting they'd used these techniques many times before to silence inconvenient witnesses. The realization that I'd been sitting across a conference table from non-human entities made me physically sick. They'd been evaluating my responses, measuring my knowledge, determining whether I posed enough of a threat to require elimination. The legal documents I'd signed weren't just classification agreements. They were intelligence assessments designed to identify anyone who understood too much about Wilson's discoveries. I walked to my living room window and looked out at the street, counting 3 vehicles that had been parked in the same positions for the past week. A gray sedan with government plates sat directly across from my building, occupied by someone who appeared to be reading a newspaper but never turned the pages. A panel van with tinted windows had been positioned at the corner since Monday, and a black SUV was parked near the apartment complex entrance with clear sight lines to my front door. The surveillance had been subtle but constant since my return from Nellis Air Force Base 5 years ago. Different vehicles, different personnel, but always the same pattern of observation and monitoring. I'd assumed it was normal post-mission security procedures, but Wilson's research suggested a more alarming explanation. These entities needed to track anyone who'd been exposed to information about their existence. They couldn't risk allowing witnesses to compare notes, conduct independent research, or reach conclusions that might threaten their infiltration operations. My teammates had been separated and assigned to different bases specifically to prevent communication about our shared experience. But they'd made a mistake by allowing me to live in civilian society, where I could access public records and conduct research they couldn't completely control. Over the past 5 years, I'd gathered enough information to understand what Wilson had tried to expose, and my phone call last night proved they knew exactly what I'd discovered. The voice on the phone hadn't sounded entirely human when I replayed it in my memory. The inflection was wrong, like someone reading words without understanding their emotional context. The warning about optical physics research had been too specific and too immediate to be coincidental. They'd been monitoring my computer activity in real time, which meant they knew I'd connected Wilson's warnings to our experience in the bunker. They knew I understood the truth about infiltrating entities and their presence in government positions. They knew I represented the same kind of threat that had gotten Wilson and his team eliminated in 1958. I returned to the kitchen table and gathered Wilson's research documents, understanding that my life was now measured in hours rather than days. These entities had spent decades protecting their secret, eliminating anyone who came too close to exposing their infiltration of American society. They'd killed Wilson's team, buried his research, and maintained surveillance over anyone who might discover the truth. But Wilson had tried to warn officials through proper channels, trusting military hierarchy and government procedures to respond appropriately to his discoveries. His faith in the system had gotten him killed because the system was already compromised at levels he couldn't imagine. I wouldn't make Wilson's mistake. The entities controlling government and military operations would never allow his warnings to reach the public through official channels. They demonstrated their willingness to eliminate anyone who threatened their secret, using legal intimidation and federal prosecution to silence witnesses before resorting to more permanent solutions. But they couldn't monitor every method of communication or control every possible avenue for exposing their presence. Wilson's research was documented in academic journals, university newsletters, and declassified government files that were already public record. His warnings about visual deception and infiltrating entities could be assembled from legitimate sources and distributed through channels these beings couldn't completely suppress. The surveillance teams outside my apartment were probably waiting for orders about how to handle my growing knowledge. They'd want to determine exactly what I'd discovered and whether I posed an immediate threat to their operations. Every moment I delayed gave them more time to coordinate whatever response they'd used against Wilson's team. I loaded Wilson's documents into my laptop bag along with backup drives containing copies of every file I'd collected over the past 5 years. The research needed to reach people who could understand its implications and take action before these entities eliminated the evidence permanently. Scientists, journalists, military personnel who hadn't been compromised, anyone willing to investigate Wilson's warnings and verify his discoveries independently. My phone rang again, displaying the same local number from last night's call. I answered without hesitation. Martinez. The same flat, emotionless voice responded immediately. Mr. Martinez, immediate compliance with federal restrictions is required. Continued research activities will result in criminal prosecution under national security statutes. Wilson tried to warn you about the infiltration, I said, watching the gray sedan across the street. You killed him for it. Silence lasted exactly 10 seconds before the voice continued. Legal proceedings will commence within 24 hours. Voluntary cooperation will be considered during sentencing recommendations." The line went dead. Through my window, I watched the gray sedan's occupant put down a phone and start the engine. The panel van and black SUV were also showing signs of activity, with personnel moving between vehicles and coordinating through radio communication. I had maybe an hour before they moved from surveillance to direct action. Wilson's research needed to reach the public immediately, before these entities could complete their suppression operations and eliminate another witness to their existence. The truth about infiltration at the highest levels of government had been buried for 60 years, but it didn't have to stay buried forever.